We'll open with a joke that's almost not a joke. Russia's newest cruise missile runs on a jet engine you can add to your cart on AliExpress. It's not a knockoff, and it's not a scavenged part pulled off a downed aircraft. It's a real, listed, buy-it-now product, originally built for hobbyist model jets. Russian engineers took that and bolted it onto a warhead, and in a single night, a Ukrainian air defense crew shot one of these down using an anti-aircraft gun older than most of their grandparents. This is the story of the S8000 Banderol, or how a cash-strapped defense industry built a missile out of the global hobby shop, and how Ukraine is knocking it out of the sky with Cold War hardware. Let's start with what the Banderol actually is, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories we're used to. Russia's cruise missile family has traditionally meant things like the Kh-101, the 3M14 Caliber, or the 9M727, fired from the Iskander K system, expensive, purpose-built weapons designed in dedicated missile bureaus, produced in relatively small numbers and reserved for high-value strikes. The Banderol is pretty much the opposite. It was developed by Kronstadt, a company that isn't a missile house at all, but the manufacturer of Russia's Orion drone, a medium-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aircraft. Kronstadt essentially took the concept of a UAV and militarized it into an expendable, jet-powered strike weapon. The result sits somewhere between a kamikaze drone and a classical cruise missile, closer in spirit to Ukraine's own rocket drones than to anything in Russia's older cruise missile lineup. On paper, this thing is small, yet packs a real punch. The Banderol cruises at roughly 600 kilometers an hour, with a top speed cited around 650, fast enough to outrun the kind of weapon systems Ukraine has traditionally used against slower Shahed-type drones. Its range is also respectable, up to 500 kilometers, enough to reach deep behind the front line from a launch point well inside occupied territory or Russian airspace. The warhead is high-explosive fragmentation, with Ukraine's defense intelligence, HER, citing a weight around 114 kilograms, though some reports put it as high as 150. Either way, this isn't a weapon built to crack open a hardened bunker. It's built to shred soft targets, radar arrays, logistics depots, apartment blocks, anything that doesn't need a dedicated bunker buster to knock out. Its primary launch platform is the Orion drone itself, and Kronstadt was reportedly working to adapt it for launch from Mi-28N attack helicopters too, which would give Russia a second delivery method with a much faster setup time. But what actually makes the Banderol newsworthy isn't the airframe, it's what's inside it. In May 2025, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence published a technical breakdown of the missile on its War and Sanctions portal, under Weapon Components, after examining intact examples recovered from strikes near Odessa. What they found looked less like a precision-guided missile and more like a parts bin assembled from half the consumer electronics industry. The engine turned out to be a Switzwin SW800 Pro, a Chinese-made turbojet originally built for large-scale model aircraft and radio-controlled jets, sold commercially and openly for around $16,000. And yes, it's listed right there on AliExpress. The rest of the parts list reads the same way. HER identified the telemetry module as likely an RFD 900X, either sourced directly from Australia or produced as a Chinese clone of the Australian design. The inertial navigation system appears to be Chinese, paired with a Russian-made Kometa M8 satellite receiver, the same jam-resistant antenna Russia has been fitting to its Shahed-derived Garand drones and its UMP and UMP glide bomb kits. The servos moving the control surfaces are South Korean Dynamixel MX64 AR units, also available on the open market. And scattered through the electronics are roughly 20 distinct types of microchips, sourced from manufacturers in the United States, China, Switzerland, Japan, and South Korea. So how does a sanctioned Russian company get its hands on parts from that many countries, made openly by firms that presumably don't want their products showing up in cruise missiles fired at Kyiv? According to HUR, most of the electronic components moved through a single distribution point, a Russian electronics wholesaler called Chip and Dip, one of the country's largest domestic distributors. From there, earlier Ukrainian intelligence reporting describes a sanctions evasion network routing these imports through intermediary countries, including Armenia, Kazakhstan, China, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, using shell companies to obscure the paper trail before the parts ever reach a Russian production line. This is traced through open-source analysis rather than a confirmed government finding, but the pattern lines up with what Western sanctions enforcement has struggled with for years. Dual-use electronics are hard to control once they've become commodity products sold at consumer scale. There's also a financial angle here. Kronstadt, the company building the Banderol, hasn't exactly been a picture of corporate stability. According to one August 2025 report, the company was facing potential bankruptcy, with around 40 lawsuits totaling roughly $7.7 million filed against it over 3 months, and no clear path to restructuring at the time. That complicates any efficient low-cost war machine framing, since even Russia's budget answer to precision strike capability appears to be running on financially shaky ground. So when did this thing actually show up on the battlefield, and how heavily is Russia actually using it? One of the earliest sightings of the Banderol was at Russia's Kapustin Yar test site in late 2024, ahead of its integration into Russia's combined missile and drone strike packages. Since then, it's become a recurring feature in some of the war's largest bombardments. Russian forces reportedly used Banderol munitions in the May 2026 strike that also included the Oreshnik missile, and it's since shown up in widespread attacks, with reports of bystanders hearing the engines of these things passing overhead. This isn't a rare experimental weapon anymore. It's being folded directly into Russia's mass strike doctrine alongside Shaheds, Kalibrs, and ballistic missiles. And that mass strike role is exactly why the Banderol is dangerous, in a way a conventional cruise missile isn't. An April 2025 open-source assessment noted that the Banderol's jet propulsion gives it a speed no ordinary drone has, which means the standard ground-based machine guns Ukrainian mobile fire teams have used to shoot down slower Shaheds simply can't track and engage it effectively. Countering it takes systems purpose-built for fast, maneuvering targets, usually radar-guided platforms, like the German-supplied Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. That's the core tactical problem here. The Banderol is fast enough to slip past the cheap counter-drone defenses Ukraine has spent 3 years building up, while being cheap enough that Russia can afford to lose a meaningful number of them along the way. It's also considerably more maneuverable than Russia's older cruise missiles, which matters against static air defense systems tuned to predict straighter, more conventional flight paths. Which brings us to the twist in this story. In mid-July 2026, Ukraine's 121st Separate Territorial Defense Brigade shot down 2 Russian aerial targets, one of them a Banderol, using 40mm Bofors L70 anti-aircraft guns. If that name doesn't ring a bell, the Bofors L70 is a Swedish-designed anti-aircraft gun that first appeared in 1947 and formally entered service in 1951, fielded by militaries around the world continuously ever since. Depending on the specific unit, we're talking about a weapon system somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 years old, with a rate of fire generally cited between 240 and 330 rounds a minute, and an effective range against aerial targets of roughly 4,000 meters. More specifically, the guns used by the 121st Brigade had no major upgrades beyond improved sights, meaning the crews are very likely doing this, with mostly manual targeting, tracking a jet-powered missile with a gun built before modern digital fire control even existed. That's especially notable because other operators have taken this exact gun the other direction, pairing the L70 with radar fire control and automatic target tracking to turn it into a genuinely modern point defense system. Ukraine's donated units, at least as reported, are the bare-bones version. Lithuania delivered the first batch back in February 2023, with additional guns supplied later by the Netherlands. So this isn't even a weapon Ukraine built or maintains. It's Cold War-era NATO surplus, repurposed to plug a very 21st century gap in air defense. It's worth a moment on the other missile that went down that same week, because the contrast tells its own story. The Kh-59, which NATO calls the AS-13 Kingbolt, is a much older design than the Banderol, dating back to Soviet development in the 1970s and 80s, now produced by Russia's Tactical Missiles Corporation. Depending on the exact variant, it has a range somewhere between roughly 115 and 290 kilometers, a top speed in the range of 900 to just over 1,000 kilometers an hour, and a warhead around 300 kilograms, considerably heavier than the Banderols. Its guidance blends inertial navigation for mid-course flight with, in its classic form, a television camera in the nose that lets an operator aboard the launch aircraft visually identify and lock onto the target during final approach. In other words, the Kh-59 is a genuinely old-school precision weapon, requiring a trained operator watching a video feed at the critical moment. The Banderol, by contrast, is largely autonomous once launched, GPS and inertial guided, and built cheaply enough that losing one to a 70-year-old anti-aircraft gun barely registers on Russia's production ledger. Same week, same brigade, same guns, but two completely different philosophies of how to build a missile. It's worth noting the Bofors story wasn't the only air defense success Ukraine had against this kind of saturation threat that week. The same reporting noted a single Ukrainian Skynex system destroyed 12 Russian aerial targets in one engagement, including a cruise missile and 11 Shahed-type drones. That's what a modern, radar-directed German air defense unit built specifically to shoot down fast, small, low-flying targets gets you, especially against drones rolling off commercial production lines. Put those two stories side by side, and you get a fairly honest snapshot of how Ukraine is actually defending its skies right now, not with one silver bullet system, but with a patchwork. On one end, a cutting-edge radar-guided German gun. On the other, a manually aimed Swedish antique, both doing the same fundamental job, because there simply aren't enough modern systems to cover everything at once. Around the same time, a video shared by an open-source analyst, going by Special Kherson Cat, appeared to show a Russian Orion drone, the same platform that carries the Banderol, burning in a field in occupied Crimea, apparently destroyed by its own side rather than by any Ukrainian action. Researchers geolocated the wreckage to a village called Ivanivka, roughly 13 kilometers from Kerch and 11 kilometers from the airfield these drones typically fly out of. It fits the broader picture of a weapons program built quickly, cheaply, and under sanctions pressure. Sometimes it works well enough to punch through Kyiv's defenses in a barrage of more than 500 weapons. And sometimes it apparently just falls out of the sky on its own side of the front line. So why does any of this actually matter? A few reasons, beyond the simple fact that a museum-piece anti-aircraft gun beat a jet-powered missile in a straight fight. Quick reminder, If you want more stories like this one, from global geopolitics to events that sound almost too strange to be real, subscribing helps a lot. Back to how the Banderol fits into the broader picture of this war. First, it's a case study in what sanctions pressure actually does to a wartime economy. You can't stop weapons production outright, but you can push a country toward improvisation. Russia can't easily source the precision optics, radiation-hardened electronics, or purpose-built turbojets that go into a traditional high-end cruise missile at the volumes it needs. So instead, it's building a missile out of parts anyone with a credit card and an AliExpress account could theoretically buy piece by piece, routed through intermediary countries and wholesale distributors to obscure the trail. That's a military-industrial complex adapting to scarcity by going down market, and it's forcing Western governments and export control regimes to reckon with just how porous consumer electronics supply chains really are when the end user has enough patience to launder a purchase through 2 or 3 intermediary countries. Second, there's the cost equation of this war, and it helps to put real numbers next to the weapons we keep mentioning. Estimates for Russia's Kh-101 vary wildly depending on who's reporting it, ranging anywhere from around $1.2 million on the low end to as much as $13 million on the high end. The caliber sits in a similarly wide band, commonly cited from around $1 million to $6 million, depending on export versus domestic variants. A standard Shahed 136 style drone, by contrast, usually runs somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000, though Ukrainian intelligence assessments of Russia's domestically produced versions have gone as high as $70,000. We're deliberately hedging all these figures because, unlike the Banderol's component list, these broader missile cost estimates are contested, not verified contracts, and different outlets disagree with each other by a factor of 5 or even 10. But even at the most conservative end of every range, a missile built around a $16,000 hobbyist jet engine and consumer-grade servos and batteries sits far closer to the drone side of that ledger than the missile side. That means Russia can produce and expend these things at a volume that would be unthinkable for something like the Kh-101, folding them into mass strikes specifically designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense through sheer simultaneous numbers rather than through any single weapon's sophistication. The Banderol isn't trying to be the smartest missile in the sky. It's trying to be one more fast-moving problem inside a barrage that already includes Shaheds. This is also where the drone versus missile argument stops being pedantic and starts actually mattering for how Ukraine builds its defenses. Russia has been running the same experiment on its Shahed line that it ran on the Banderol, bolting jet engines onto what used to be simple propeller-driven loitering munitions, producing variants like the Jiran 3 and Jiran 5 that reportedly hit speeds around 500 to 600 kilometers an hour, squarely inside cruise missile territory. Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Ichnat has put it bluntly. On radar, one of these jet-powered variants reads as a cruise missile purely from its flight parameters, simply because of how fast it's moving. That determines which interceptor a Ukrainian battery commander reaches for, and interceptors aren't interchangeable in price. A single AIM-120 AMRAAM, the missile NASAMS batteries have used against slower Shaheds, runs somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million a shot. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor runs closer to $4 million. When a $16,000 engine forces you to spend $500,000 to several million dollars just to knock it out of the sky, that exchange rate is the entire point of the weapon, whether you file it under drone or missile. It's worth adding that Ukraine is playing this same game in the opposite direction. Ukraine's Palyanytsia missile drone, first used in combat in August 2024, weighs around 320 kilograms with roughly a 100-kilogram warhead, takes off on a solid fuel booster before its turbojet engine takes over, and reportedly reaches speeds up to 900 kilometers an hour with a range around 650 kilometers, nearly comparable to the KH-101. Ukrainian officials have put its unit cost under $1 million, with some estimates going lower still. Its sibling program, the Peklo, is reportedly even cheaper to build than Ukraine's Lyuty long-range attack drone, which itself costs around $200,000, while reaching speeds up to 700 kilometers an hour and a range of roughly 700 kilometers, with developers claiming up to 70% domestically produced components. In other words, both sides have independently landed on the same conclusion, that the fastest way to close the gap between cheap drone and expensive missile is to just build something that splits the difference, and whoever can build more of that hybrid class faster is going to hold the edge in this particular arms race. Third, these weapons matter because they're forcing Ukraine to fight an asymmetric defensive war on two very different technological levels at once. On one end, Ukraine is fielding genuinely cutting-edge systems, German Gepards purpose-built to track fast, maneuvering targets, and early laser-based counter-drone systems we've covered elsewhere. On the other end, when the modern systems aren't available in enough numbers, Ukrainian crews reach for whatever actually works, including donated, decades-old anti-aircraft guns with little more than an upgraded sight. That a Bofors L70 can still bring down a 2026 vintage jet-powered missile isn't really a story about Cold War engineering being ahead of its time. It's a story about air defense still coming down, at its core, to whether a crew can track, aim, and put rounds in front of a target before it arrives, and about how thin Ukraine's air defense inventory has had to stretch to cover every altitude, speed, and flight profile Russia keeps throwing at it. Put it all together, and the Banderol tells us something bigger about where this war's weapons technology is heading. The line between drone and cruise missile is dissolving. What used to be two separate categories with two separate defensive playbooks is collapsing into a single class of fast, cheap, jet or prop-powered, GPS and inertial-guided munitions built largely from off-the-shelf parts. Ukraine's own Palyanytsia and Peklo programs are essentially the same idea, running in the opposite direction. Whoever can build these things faster and cheaper, and whoever adapts their air defense the quickest, is going to hold the edge in the next phase of this fight. For now, the score in this particular matchup goes to Ukraine's old gun, and that itself is notable, because it suggests we're not quite done seeing weapons that by all accounts should be obsolete. The front line in Ukraine is essentially a walking museum of weapons spanning entire technological generations, all showcasing just how much every small edge in ingenuity and adaptation can matter. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next.